Vikram Sarabhai was a Renaissance man. His family was often known as, the Medici family, which we know helped fuel the Renaissance. Many people talk about how Dr. Sarabhai displayed a remarkable lack of insecurity about working with people who were brighter than himself. Many people talk about how he was a simple, unassuming man. The name Vikram means valorous, one who is wise, brave, and strong, and also victorious. It's hard to isolate the science from the scientist, the man, Vikram Sarabhai, from his methods. So sometimes I'll take a bird's eye view, sometimes I'll take a worm's eye view, and sometimes I will take another person's view, and all to try to paint a picture of Sarabhai and sight, what came before and what came after, through a deeply sort of personal narrative. There's several of us who sort of, made up the middle, who didn't actually know him, but were inspired by his vision. My sources, hence, are my own experience and my own stories that I've gathered. I told you about Professor Chitnis and talking to Kiran Karnik about Vikram Sarabhai. I do remember meeting Mallika Sarabhai a few times in my life, Vikram Sarabhai's daughter. She was in Los Angeles in 1989, and she was there for several weeks in Los Angeles for the performance of Peter Brook's Mahabharat, and Mallika was playing Draupadi. And, I couldn't afford the best seat, so I was the person in the last row of the last, I was in the last row and sort of had to use binoculars to see the performance, although the audio was good. And I remember during the break asking the light guy, the lighting person who was not very far away from me, if he knew Mallika and if it would be okay for me to pass a note to her. And so I scribbled on a piece of paper, I'm Arvind Singhal, I'm at the USC Annenberg School, I'm a great fan of your father, even though I never met him, and would it be possible to meet? And the next morning she called me, and an hour later I picked her up. I was her chauffeur. We had lunch at the USC Faculty Club with Ev Rogers. We reminisced about Dr. Rogers' time in India, and I took very copious notes in terms of her recollections of her father. And what I distinctly remember is Mallika telling me that she felt that her father was always in deep thought. And she even mentioned Rodin and his, you may remember his statue, La Penseur, which basically means the thinker. And but what is unique about Rodin's statue is that the person who is thinking is poised for action, almost ready to take off. And showing or representing in Rodin's words, or in Mallika's words about her father, that here was a man who believed in thinking, in deep thinking, believed that there was strength in thinking, and was always ready to act. And I think it's hard to shake away a memory such as the one that Mallika provided about her father, in addition to many others, as we understand sight and its legacy in many ways. I spent 2 days at ISRO in Bangalore as a doctoral student in the summer of 1988. This was a time when I was very interested in the emergence of Bangalore as India's Silicon Valley. This is because my mentor, Ev Rogers, was very interested in Silicon Valleys all around the world. And I was in India for the summer doing work on Hum Log, the entertainment education television serial, which again you can say is a legacy of Dr. Sarabhai, because as Pramod Kaleji was saying, that in the late 83, 84 period, India was putting one terrestrial transmitter a day. And so you had all this hardware in place, learning from the experience of sight, but of course, there was not much of indigenous software. And that resulted in the creation of this television program, 156 episodes, entertaining and educational, which became part of my doctoral dissertation. So in many ways, all these intersections, whether it was hosting Malika in Los Angeles or, researching Hum Log and, developing in some ways my own niche in the diffusion of innovations. I was talking about being in Bangalore, and I know one story leads to the other. And spending 2 hours, and I don't know how that happened, with Satish Dhawan, who was the chairman of ISRO at that time. And again, like Professor Chitnis, Mr. Dhawan was a very different personality, but he again regaled me with stories about Vikram Sarabhai. And I also worked quite closely with Dr. Bhaskara Rao, continue to work with him and his unit. As you know, he was president of ORG, Operations Research Group. And we also know that that was one of Vikram Sarabhai's great contribution, in addition to so many other contributions in terms of institutions. The value of audits, the value of professional research, operations research, public research, social research, and research with a human face, in addition to, of course, serving the needs of the market. When we landed in Ahmedabad, we did a sort of a tour of the Sarabhai institutions. I remember spending the morning going to Sabarmati Ashram, which again has a Sarabhai connection, as we know, Ambalal Sarabhai being a great benefactor of the Sabarmati Ashram. Vikram's aunt, Anusuya, was, as we know, a labor leader. She studied at the London School of Economics, came back, and the Mazdoor union, so in some ways taking on the mill owners, and she of course was on the side of the mill workers when Gandhiji in 1918 was the arbiter of that conflict. And of course Mridula Sarabhai, who was Vikram's sister, 6 years older than Vikram, who was part of the Vanar Sena that Indira Gandhi had started, was deeply active in the salt satyagraha, and of course was Gandhi's constant companion in Nalkoli in 1947 during the riots post partition. I had been to Sabarmati Ashram several times before. It's because my Nanaji, my mother's Chachaji, was the governor of Gujarat in I remember visiting with him in 1970, 71 a few times. And, you had a state car that came to pick you up at the train station. And I remember, as an 8-year-old going to Sabarmati, being very intrigued. I remember going to Calico Mills, the showroom of Calico Mills, which again was the Ambalal Sarabhai enterprise. I remember we got nice scarves as gifts. I remember going to Sarabhai Chemicals in Baroda, where again, we got some beautiful, nice pouches. And, you know, as an 8 or a 9-year-old, you remember all these things. All this to say that, you know, your day began at Sabarmati Ashram, and now you can connect the dots in reverse, which is exactly what I'm doing. You know, how the Sarabhai family was deeply influenced by Gandhi, perhaps the only family which was in the textile business, and most of its members dressed in khaddar. And I mean, this is the irony of it, that, you know, Ambalal Sarabhai had this big, and he was the textile magnate of India, and yet through Anusuya Sarabhai and Mridula, I mean, they even had curtains of khaddar or khadi in their homes. It's also interesting in some ways that here is one of the wealthiest man or family in India, and at any given time during the freedom struggle, thanks to the close association of the Sarabhai family with Gandhi, with Mahatma Gandhi, one or two of them were always in jail. And Ambalal Sarabhai always refused to pay the fines for these people to get out of jail, because, you know, that was the Gandhian way of non-cooperation with something that you considered as being unjust or evils. And this is sort of the atmosphere in which Vikram Sarabhai, in many ways, grew up. And I remember we spent time at the Indian Institute of Management-Ahmedabad, another Sarabhai institution, admiring the Louis Kahn architecture. And then I think, Noshir, our day ended with Karthikeya at Viksat, which was an organization that he ran. I have memories of little reptiles walking on the Viksat, you know, and of course, then later you figure out that Karthikeya had deep and strong interest in environmental issues. I remember Karthikeya telling us stories about how his father was often the parent, because his mother Mrinalini, such an accomplished dancer, she lived to be 97, passed away only in 2016, was pretty much always on tour, you know, abroad doing performances or in India. And it's not that Vikram Sarabhai was not a busy man, but both Mallika and Karthikeya talked about how, even though he had so many things going on, he always found time to be with them. I especially remember Karthikeya telling us at that time something that we then put in this book. In 1989, it was published. Singhal and Rogers, I was still a doctoral student at the Annenberg School. That story we put in this book about how when Karthikeya came down with hepatitis, Vikram Sarabhai actually took leave from all his pressing responsibilities and stayed with him and took care of him and nourished him back to health. Now, this book also, since I'm talking about, you know, first paper was on site, and this book was dedicated to Vikram Sarabhai, and it came out in 1989, and it said, dedicated to Vikram Sarabhai, who saw a revolution coming and helped make it happen. So anyway, Vikram Sarabhai was a Renaissance man. His family was often known as, you know, the Medici family, which we know helped fuel the Renaissance. And we should look at sight in that context. I don't know how many of you know, but both Ambalal Sarabhai and Sarla, his wife, Vikram's parents, were deeply enamored by Maria Montessori and her work. And in many ways, in the retreat, this 20+ acre complex in Ahmedabad, which I visited later, they basically created not just a Montessori school, but a living, breathing Montessori university for the Sarabhai children. So this is the making of the man, I think. Vikram, like many of us, loved cricket. He was a phenomenal bicyclist. He loved to to be on the road on his bicycle with his hands often folded on his chest. He was a risk taker, eternal optimist. All these things are relevant. And of course, we know he had a deep love of aesthetics and art and food. And, idlis and batata vadas were his favorite. The Sarabhai home had visitors like Erik Erikson, Rabindranath Tagore, Jagdish Chandra Bose, Prithviraj Kapoor. Now, just imagine a childhood where, when he was born and he was about a year old and Tagore came to visit the Sarabhais, he looked at Vikram's broad forehead and said, and I quote, this boy is going to make great things happen. And it was Tagore who wrote a recommendation letter for Vikram when he was 16 and applying to Cambridge. And you can imagine, here's a Nobel laureate in literature writing to Cambridge and saying, this child is good. I know his family and please accept him. And then when the war happened and his father encouraged him to come back, which was in 1940, so Vikram was 21, a deal was struck that he would come work with C.V. Raman. These were the only two Nobel Prize winning Indians we had, no? So imagine Tagore recommending him and then Vikram coming back to Bangalore as part of the deal with Cambridge to work with C.V. Raman. And of course, this was also the time that Homi Bhabha was vacationing in India. Bhabha was in Cambridge and because of the war didn't go back. And so here we have these two giants of Indian science with C.V. Raman at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And you can imagine when I was doing work on Bangalore as India's Silicon Valley, these themes kept coming up. Here you have Bhabha, who developed TIFR, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, the atomic energy. And after Bhabha's death, we know it was Sarabhai who took it over. Now what we know as BARC, Trombay. These were legends. And both these men, in some ways, were born with a silver spoon. How can we not, remember that these were people who were men of privilege, deep privilege, but also in some ways, people who were imbued with a deep sense of public service. And they began to use privilege, which they had, to create the pathways for others to grow. Amrita Shah, who wrote a book on Vikram Sarabhai in 2007. I remember traveling to New York to talk to Amrita, once again collecting stories. And she told me that the Sarabhai home in India, the compound, the retreat, had a workshop with lathe machines, a foundry, a separate physics and chemistry lab, that Vikram Sarabhai was fascinated by trains, in fact, built one that he could ride on. And some of this equipment came to be the early equipment for the founding of the Physical Research Laboratory, PRL, in 1947. So, it doesn't surprise us in many ways that Vikram Sarabhai was who he was, growing up in the context of where he grew up, a life of great privilege, conversations with Tagore's and Erikson's, being recommended by Tagore, being under the tutelage of C.V. Raman, and then, of course, producing a generation of students and mentees like our missile man, who later became President, Abdul Kalam. In many ways, sight was to Sarabhai what salt was to Gandhi. And you know that Gandhi did his salt march, leaving the Sabarmati ashram. That was actually the last time he was there, because he basically said, I'm not coming back. And then later, of course, he went on and founded Sevagram, which is where my mother's Chachaji worked with him. And like Gandhi's Salt March, phenomenal campaign of taking on the British government for something that was indigenous, salt, something that everybody needs. and creating a mass movement in a day where there was no television and really no radio. Of course, he had his Harijan, the newspaper or the India Opinion that Gandhi founded, which of course Sarabhai and all the Sarabhai children read, and how he mobilized the country with salt. In some ways, I would say, and there was something that happened before and something that happened after. What salt was to Gandhi and what he did for India's height in some ways was to Vikram, and what he did to India in terms of putting into place the mechanisms that created the conditions for us to be who we are and for us to gather here and talk about him. So we also should talk about the word Swadeshi, because if you look at the institutions that Vikram Sarabhai built, and you can call site an institution, or certainly the Space Application Center, or when you're in Ahmedabad, you just say satellite, Janai, right? And they know what you mean. The whole notion of Swadeshi was so key to him. With Professor Rogers, I was once invited for dinner to the home of Mr. I.K. Gujral, who had just returned to India. He was the ambassador to Russia. And this is before he became prime minister. I think it was 86 or 87. And Mr. Gujral, and we, of course, at the dinner table, while Mrs. Gujral served us wonderful food, and, it was a wonderful evening. I distinctly remember the conversation, part of the conversation being about Vikram Sarabhai, when Mr. Gujral, when he was Minister of State for Communication, said that the one time, and this was maybe in the late 60s, the one time that I saw Vikram Sarabhai agitated was when there was talk by the Indian government to have the Canadians build the Earth station, which would make possible the receiving of signals from the ATS-6 satellite. And that Sarabhai was, he was viscerally upset, said Mr. Gujral, the only one time that he remembers, because he said, all this work that we are doing is because of mesh antenna, 10 feet wide. Think about it, made of aluminum mesh, and which means it's light and it's cheap and it can be transported to 2,400 villages, as many of us have said. It could be easily installed, and because it's a mesh, even if there are winds, cyclonic winds, if it's secured at the base, the winds would pass through. And this was beautiful, the development of the ruggedized television sets, so that they could, handle heat and humidity. And so SITE was a little more than, just an experiment in transmitting information. That was an important part of it, but an important part of it was the Swadeshi, the chicken mesh antennas and the ruggedized TV sets. And much like the spinning wheel was Swadeshi, the Earth station that was built was Swadeshi. We cannot also talk about Sarabhai if we don't talk about Swarajya. And that's linked in some ways to the notion of salt as a symbol, or Swadeshi as in a chicken mesh antenna, because Swarajya, as we know, to Tilak, to Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Swarajya was self-rule, not under the colonists. And to Gandhi, it was that, home rule. But to Gandhi, Swarajya also meant Rajya over the self, self-discipline, and which is the basic principle of the discipline that is required for ahimsa, for you to be a soldier of nonviolence. And in the step-by-step process that Vikram Sarabhai implemented in many of the things that he did, you see that notion of being independent, but also at the same time having the discipline and the patience and the energy to persist. And there's a deeply interpersonal and relational side of Dr. Sarabhai, which made these things possible. We don't theorize that too much. And I think what I'm trying to say is it's important to do that. And communication is not just technology and information transfer. It is about trust. It is about the relationships that one forms. And in his own words, Vikram Sarabhai said, and here's something that I just read for you: a leader has to be a cultivator, then a manufacturer. He has to provide the soil and the overall climate and environment in which the seed can grow. And that was the reason why they looked for fresh scientific minds, like the minds of a U.R. Rao or a E.V. Chitnis or a Pramod Kale, rather than trained technologists. It was a sort of a conscious decision that you grow people. And whoever you talk to, all these people whom I have met, whether it's Malika or Karthikeya or Professor Chitnis and Kiran Karnik or Binod Bhai and Arvind Singhal, they all talk about Sarabhai's ability to communicate a sense of purpose and challenge, that he could encourage young people to take risks while at the same time using his privilege to protect them from others' destructiveness. And he was good at not just building individuals, which is great by itself, but building teams and building organizations. All these elements, relationships, developing teams, networks, boundary spanning. These were things which Sarabhai did beautifully. Abdul Kalam remembers his first meeting with Dr. Sarabhai. I was almost immediately struck by Dr. Sarabhai's warmth. His questions did not probe my existing knowledge or skills. This is the interview, first. Rather, they were exploration of the possibilities I was filled with. Dr. Sarabhai was looking at me as if in a reference to the larger whole. And to theorize sight, we cannot, in some ways, disassociate this aspect of this Renaissance man, this man of great privilege, but imbued with a sense of Swadeshi and Swaraj. Many people talk about how Dr. Sarabhai displayed a remarkable lack of insecurity about working with people who were brighter than himself. Many people talk about how he was a simple, unassuming man. And I think it was Kamala Chowdhury who once said that one came out a meeting with Vikram somewhat more whole, somewhat more responsible, and somewhat more charitable to others. Again, these institutions don't happen just because you have the technology. They happen because of this ongoing process of creating webs of relationships across individuals and institutions, developing trust. There's a story of how Vikram Sarabhai repainted one of his staff peoples, somebody who was in the housekeeping staff, his dwelling because his wife had allergies. Which leader would do that? He always came to the birthday parties of his staff's children. His favorite words were collaboration, mutuality, leapfrogging, reconciliation. There are many stories about how there was a tussle between Sarabhai and Homi Setna when Sarabhai took over the Atomic Energy Commission, and Setna felt very threatened, and how Sarabhai dealt with it in terms of reconciliation. In the final closing, I'll say that the name Vikram means valorous, one who is wise, brave, and strong, and also victorious. But we also know that he was a candle that burned at many ends, a candle that ignited minds, which was also the name, as you know, of the book written by President Kalam. And he was a candle that also, helped build the solid booster rockets, the cryogenic fuel that launched India in the space age. I think this is a remarkable man, a Renaissance man, and we are all beholden to him.